There is a possibility I want you to consider, even if your first reaction is to question it. What if the confusion, distance, and emotional withdrawal you experience were not necessarily proof that you meant nothing to this person? What if, in some cases, those changes appeared because the connection had become more emotionally significant than they knew how to handle? This does not mean every distant behavior is secretly a sign of love, and it does not excuse hurtful treatment. But understanding avoidant attachment can reveal a very different explanation for why someone may become more guarded, precisely when a relationship begins to feel important. One of the most confusing patterns in avoidant attachment is that increasing closeness can sometimes activate increasing defenses. The relationship begins with warmth, openness, attention, and genuine connection. Then, as emotional investment grows, something changes. The person who once seemed comfortable suddenly becomes harder to reach. Conversations become shorter. Affection becomes inconsistent. Emotional walls appear where there was once openness. To the person on the receiving end, this can feel like a complete reversal. You may start wondering whether you misunderstood everything, whether the connection was ever genuine, or whether you simply imagined the closeness. But attachment patterns can create a much more complicated picture. For some avoidantly attached people, emotional intimacy can activate fears that have little to do with the actual person standing in front of them. The closer the relationship becomes, the more vulnerable they may feel, and vulnerability can trigger the instinct to create distance. This is one of the central contradictions of avoidant attachment. Someone can genuinely value connection while simultaneously becoming uncomfortable when that connection becomes emotionally intense. Instead of moving toward closeness, they may instinctively create space. Instead of explaining what they feel, they may minimize it. Instead of asking for reassurance, they may convince themselves that they do not need anyone. What looks like indifference from the outside can sometimes be a protective reaction happening beneath the surface. But remember, understanding the pattern does not mean excusing the behavior. Someone can be acting from fear and still cause real emotional harm. Both things can be true at once. The important part is understanding what may be happening psychologically, so that you do not automatically turn someone else's withdrawal into a statement about your own worth. Avoidant attachment is often discussed as if it was simply a collection of personality traits or deliberate relationship tactics. But attachment patterns can also involve the nervous system and the way a person has learned to respond to emotional closeness. These responses usually develop over time. A child who repeatedly experiences inconsistency, emotional unavailability, rejection, or a lack of reliable comfort may gradually learn that depending on others is unsafe or disappointing. That lesson does not necessarily become a conscious thought such as, "I should never become close to anyone." Instead, it can become an automatic expectation carried into later relationships. The person may learn to rely heavily on themselves, suppress emotional needs, minimize vulnerability, or retreat whenever intimacy begins feeling overwhelming. Their nervous system has essentially learned to protect them by creating distance before they can experience what it interprets as emotional danger. As adulthood unfolds, that old pattern can appear inside romantic relationships without the person fully understanding why. They may genuinely want connection, yet become uncomfortable when someone gets too close. They may enjoy affection until it begins to feel emotionally demanding. They may feel secure when there is plenty of space, but unsettled when the relationship starts requiring deeper vulnerability. This can create an exhausting push and pull dynamic. One moment they seem deeply connected, and the next they appear detached. One day they may want closeness, while another day they suddenly need distance. The person on the other side often experiences this as rejection and begins searching for an explanation. But sometimes, the explanation is not that the connection suddenly became meaningless. Sometimes, the connection became meaningful enough to activate an old protective pattern. Think about the beginning of many relationships. Before the emotional stakes become intense, an avoidantly attached person may seem surprisingly comfortable with closeness. They can be affectionate, attentive, playful, curious, and deeply engaged. They may enjoy long conversations and seem genuinely excited about getting to know someone. During this stage, the relationship can feel safe because emotional vulnerability has not yet reached the point where their strongest defenses are activated. Everything feels manageable. There is attraction without overwhelming emotional dependence. There is connection without the fear of losing personal freedom. There is affection without the pressure of revealing every vulnerable part of themselves. That early version of the relationship can therefore feel incredibly real. And it may have been real. The warmth you experience does not automatically become fake simply because the relationship later became difficult. The affection, conversations, laughter, attention, and emotional openness may have reflected genuine feelings at the time. What changed may not have been the existence of the connection, but the emotional meaning attached to it. As the relationship becomes deeper, the person may begin recognizing how much they actually care. And ironically, recognizing that importance can make vulnerability feel more dangerous. Now there is something to lose. Now rejection would hurt more. Now dependence feels more possible. Now the relationship has the power to affect them deeply. For someone whose nervous system has learned to associate closeness with emotional risk, that realization can trigger protective behavior. They may start finding reasons to spend more time alone. They may become unusually critical of the relationship. They may focus on small flaws that previously did not bother them. They may convince themselves that they need freedom, that the relationship is moving too quickly, or that their feelings are not as strong as they originally believed. Sometimes they may emotionally shut down, without even understanding what triggered the change. This is where the experience becomes especially painful for the other person. You remember who they were before the distance appeared. You remember how attentive they seemed, how naturally they connected with you, and how safe the relationship once felt. Then suddenly, you are dealing with someone who seems almost unfamiliar. You may ask yourself, how can someone go from being so close to becoming so distant? The answer may involve an attachment system that becomes activated when emotional intimacy crosses a certain threshold. Instead of experiencing closeness simply as comfort, the nervous system may begin interpreting it as a threat to independence or emotional safety. And once that happens, protective strategies can take over. The person may not consciously decide, I am going to hurt this relationship. Everything you experienced in those early stages may have been completely genuine. The warmth you felt, the openness you witnessed, and the emotional connection you shared do not automatically become meaningless simply because the relationship later changed. The version of the avoidantly attached person you met at the beginning may have been a sincere expression of who they were when their protective defenses were relatively quiet. They could connect, laugh, communicate, show affection, and allow themselves to be vulnerable because the relationship had not yet reached the level of intimacy that activated their strongest fears. In that stage, closeness could feel exciting rather than overwhelming. They could enjoy the relationship without constantly feeling exposed by it. But many people with avoidant patterns have an internal threshold where emotional intimacy begins to feel less like comfort and more like a loss of safety or independence. That threshold is not always obvious from the outside. As trust develops, attachment deepens, and the relationship becomes increasingly important, that boundary can gradually move closer. Eventually, the emotional intensity may cross it, and that is when their behavior can appear to change almost overnight. To understand what may be happening, you have to look beyond the behavior and consider the emotional process underneath it. When an avoidantly attached person becomes deeply connected to someone, they may not experience that closeness in the same uncomplicated way that a securely attached person might. Instead of simply thinking, I love this person and I feel safe becoming closer, their nervous system may begin associating the growing intimacy with vulnerability, dependence, or potential loss. The result can be a powerful internal conflict. One part of them wants connection, while another part wants protection. The closer they feel emotionally, the stronger the urge to regain distance may become. From the outside, this can look like a sudden loss of interest. Internally, however, the person may be experiencing discomfort that they do not fully understand. Their instinct may be to create space before they have even consciously identified why they feel the need for it. This does not mean every withdrawal is secretly caused by love, and it certainly does not mean that harmful behavior should be excused. It simply means that emotional distancing can sometimes be connected to a person's difficulty tolerating vulnerability, rather than being a straightforward measurement of how much they care. That distinction matters, because otherwise the person being pushed away may immediately turn the entire experience inward and ask, "What did I do wrong?" Sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes the relationship simply reached an emotional depth that activated an old protective pattern. This is one reason avoidant behavior can feel so sudden. One day, they may seem engaged and emotionally present. They listen carefully, communicate frequently, show affection, and make you feel like the relationship is moving naturally forward. Then, something shifts. Their replies become shorter. Their emotional availability decreases. They stop sharing as openly. The warmth you were accustomed to seems to disappear, and every attempt to restore the previous closeness appears to make them retreat even further. From your perspective, it can feel as though a completely different person has appeared. But from an attachment perspective, the internal meaning of the relationship may have changed. The connection has become more significant, and significance can make vulnerability feel more threatening to someone whose nervous system learned to protect itself through emotional distance. One defensive response is simply shutting down emotionally. Instead of discussing what they feel, they become quieter. Instead of asking for reassurance, they convince themselves that they need space. Instead of acknowledging that the relationship matters, they may start acting as though it matters less. This can be incredibly confusing because the behavior seems disconnected from the closeness that existed only recently. Yet emotional shutdown can function as a protective strategy. By reducing emotional contact, they reduce the intensity they are experiencing internally. Another pattern that can appear is an unexpected increase in criticism. Suddenly, things that never seemed important become major issues. Small habits become irritating. Minor disagreements receive disproportionate attention. Qualities they once admired may suddenly become the very things they complain about. You may find yourself wondering whether you changed, or whether you somehow became less attractive, interesting, or compatible. But sometimes the criticism is less about an objective change in the other person, and more about the avoidant mind searching for reasons to create emotional distance. If the relationship feels overwhelmingly important, focusing on imperfections can make it easier to convince oneself that stepping away is reasonable. The mind begins collecting evidence that supports distance because distance feels safer than vulnerability. This can create one of the most painful contradictions in avoidant relationships. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the more intensely the person may begin searching for reasons why it should not continue. What looks like sudden dissatisfaction may sometimes be part of an unconscious attempt to reduce emotional intensity. Again, that does not make the behavior harmless. Criticism can deeply affect the other person's confidence, and no attachment explanation should be used to justify repeated disrespect. But understanding the mechanism can prevent you from automatically assuming that every criticism proves you were never good enough. Another common shift involves withdrawing the very behaviors that once made the relationship feel special. Perhaps they once gave you their full attention. They wanted to know about your day. They remembered small details. They initiated conversations and seemed genuinely curious about your thoughts. They made time for you without you having to ask. Then, gradually or suddenly, those behaviors begin disappearing. The person who once seemed eager to connect now seems difficult to reach. The contrast can be painful because you have a clear memory of how different things used to feel. You may spend hours comparing the past with the present, trying to identify the exact moment when everything changed. But the important question is not always, when did they stop caring? Sometimes the more useful question is, when did closeness begin feeling unsafe for them? Those are two very different questions. The first makes you search for a flaw in yourself. The second helps you recognize the possibility of an attachment response. As the emotional stakes increase, an avoidantly attached person may also begin emphasizing independence. They may suddenly need more personal space, become protective of their routines, or emphasize how much they value being alone. They might talk about feeling pressured, even when you were not intentionally pressuring them. They may interpret ordinary emotional needs as demands. They may convince themselves that the relationship is restricting them, even when the relationship has not fundamentally changed. These reactions can be difficult to understand because they may appear disproportionate to what is actually happening. But if closeness has become associated with losing autonomy, then even normal intimacy can feel unusually demanding. The person may retreat, not because the other individual has become unbearable, but because their internal alarm has become louder. And when that alarm is active, logic does not always lead the response. The person may know intellectually that they are safe, while still feeling emotionally compelled to create distance. This is why simply telling someone, "You have nothing to be afraid of," rarely solves the underlying problem. The response is not always based on a conscious decision. It can be an ingrained pattern that requires self-awareness and healthier emotional skills to change. There can also be a strange cycle in which distance initially brings relief. Once the avoidant creates enough space, the emotional pressure may decrease. They can feel more independent and less overwhelmed. This temporary relief can reinforce the distancing behavior because their nervous system learns, "When I feel emotionally overwhelmed, creating space makes the discomfort go away." But that does not necessarily resolve the underlying attachment conflict. After enough time passes, they may miss the connection again. They may remember the positive parts of the relationship and feel drawn back toward closeness. Then, once intimacy begins increasing again, the same protective response can return. This can create a painful push and pull cycle in which closeness feels good until it becomes too emotionally intense. Distance provides relief, and eventually, the desire for connection returns. The person on the receiving end can become exhausted trying to understand which version of the relationship is real. But perhaps both versions are real. The caring person and the guarded person can exist within the same individual. The problem is that their emotional system may not yet know how to hold love and vulnerability at the same time. This is why it is so important not to reduce avoidant attachment to the idea that someone is simply playing games. Some people absolutely behave manipulatively, and unhealthy behavior should be recognized for what it is. But not every withdrawal is calculated. Sometimes a person is reacting automatically to emotional discomfort they have never learned to regulate. Understanding that distinction can give you clarity without requiring you to excuse the consequences. Most importantly, you should never use an attachment explanation to convince yourself that you must endure endless inconsistency while waiting for someone to become emotionally available. Their internal struggles may be real, but they are still responsible for how they treat other people. You can understand their fear while maintaining your boundaries. You can recognize that their withdrawal may come from self-protection without deciding that you must chase them until they feel safe. You can acknowledge that the early connection was genuine without allowing the memory of that connection to keep you trapped in an unhealthy cycle. Sometimes the most empowering realization is simply this: their defenses may explain their behavior, but they do not define your worth. The warmth you experience does not need to be rewritten as fake just because the relationship became complicated. And their withdrawal does not have to become proof that you are somehow unlovable. It may simply reveal the limits of what they were emotionally prepared to handle at that point in their life. They remembered the smallest details, noticed things most people would overlook, and made you feel understood in a way that seemed rare. Their attention felt natural. Their curiosity about you felt genuine. You could sense that they were emotionally present because they noticed not only what you said, but the little things behind your words. Yet as the relationship moved into deeper emotional territory, those qualities often began to fade. The attentiveness became less consistent. Their curiosity turned into distance. The sense of being truly understood was gradually replaced by emotional silence. From your side, it could feel like the person you originally connected with had disappeared. But often, the situation is more complicated than that. The warmth did not necessarily vanish because their feelings disappeared. Instead, their protective system may have decided that continuing to express such deep closeness would make the attachment even stronger, and that level of vulnerability felt increasingly unsafe. The emotional walls became higher. The warmth became more controlled. The openness that once seemed effortless became measured and restrained. And you noticed immediately, because you were not simply missing affection, You were missing the particular way this person once made you feel seen, heard, and important. Naturally, you wanted that connection back. You tried to communicate more clearly. You reached for reassurance. You looked for explanations. You attempted to recreate the emotional closeness that had once felt so natural between you. But there was a painful mismatch happening underneath the surface. What you experienced as an attempt to repair the relationship could be experienced by an avoidant nervous system as even greater emotional pressure. You move closer because you want connection. Their fear increases because the connection is becoming more intense. That fear creates more withdrawal, which makes you reach harder for answers, which can make them retreat even further. And suddenly, both people are caught inside a cycle neither fully understands. Eventually, you may find yourself asking the question that hurts the most. What did I do wrong? Before you allow that question to become your identity, consider another possibility. The loss of closeness does not automatically mean that you became less lovable, less interesting, or somehow unworthy of the affection you once received. Sometimes the relationship became emotionally significant enough to activate defenses that had been built long before you entered their life. That distinction is important because it changes the story you tell yourself. At the same time, understanding attachment psychology should never become an excuse for tolerating behavior that repeatedly hurts you. There is a real danger in learning about someone's wounds and then using those wounds to explain away everything they do. Understanding why someone withdraws does not mean you are required to accept endless withdrawal. Knowing that fear may be underneath their behavior does not make emotional neglect healthy. And recognizing that someone may care about you does not mean you must remain in a relationship where your own emotional needs are continually ignored. Explanation and acceptance are two completely different things. You can understand someone's defenses while still maintaining strong boundaries. You can have compassion for their struggles without sacrificing your own well-being to prove that you understand them. Most importantly, I want you to be careful about the story you carry forward from this experience. Many people leave emotionally confusing relationships with a belief that becomes much more damaging than the relationship itself. They start thinking, when someone gets close enough to really know me, they eventually lose interest. Or, maybe the more authentic I become, the more people will pull away. Or even, something about me must have caused them to change. Those conclusions can feel convincing because the sequence of events was real. The closeness happened. The withdrawal happened. That is why real healing rarely happens overnight. It is a gradual process, often uncomfortable and demanding, because it requires a person to question protective patterns that may have been shaping their relationships for years. It takes repetition, self-awareness, and the courage to remain present with emotions that once felt impossible to tolerate. Most importantly, it is work that nobody else can do for them. You can encourage someone who is genuinely committed to growing, but you cannot carry their healing for them. Your patience cannot replace their effort. Your reassurance cannot replace their self-awareness. And your love cannot do the internal work they have chosen not to face. So what does this mean for you? It means that someone who pulled away as emotional intimacy increased may not be destined to repeat that pattern forever. People can change. With honest reflection, sustained effort, emotional accountability, and a real willingness to confront the fears beneath their defenses, they can gradually develop a healthier relationship with closeness. They can learn that intimacy does not automatically mean losing themselves. They can discover that vulnerability does not have to end in rejection. They can learn to stay present when their instinct tells them to disappear. But that future depends on a choice they must make themselves. You cannot build it through hope alone, and you should never have to destroy your own emotional well-being while waiting for someone to become ready. Change is possible, and there are people who genuinely transform these patterns. They begin recognizing the moments when their old defenses activate. Instead of immediately withdrawing, they learn to pause. Instead of shutting down, they learn to communicate. Instead of treating vulnerability as something dangerous, they gradually become more comfortable experiencing it. Over time, emotional closeness can stop feeling like an emergency and start becoming something they can tolerate and appreciate. But that transformation requires active participation. Eventually, protecting the relationship has to become more important than protecting the defenses that once seemed necessary for survival.